Good morning. Welcome to Coffee with the Garden Club. Today I'm going to talk about squash and why I grow primarily moschata species squash. There are several popular types of squash to grow, popular species, all in the Cucurbita genus, and one of them I have found works better than the others. Most of the squash that you grow and that you're familiar with is probably from the Pepo species, and that is like the standard pumpkins that you see on Halloween. It's the summer squash, it's zucchini, it's acorn squash. Very popular species to grow, but I have found that it is very challenging for several reasons. One is that it's very susceptible to mildews. Another reason is it's very susceptible to pests, such as the squash vine borer, which has caused all kinds of problems for me in the past. And I spent a lot of time trying to dig these little borers out of my stalks of squash that I was trying to keep alive. And it's just very frustrating. And eventually I did some research to find out how to avoid this, and I found that really the best way to do this is to grow plants that are naturally resistant to the squash vine borer, and that is the primary reason why I discovered the moschata varieties. But that's why I discovered them, but I learned to love them for other reasons. You know, another thing about the Pepo varieties is many of them are bush varieties, or they are sprawling plants, and I just don't have a whole lot of space. One of the great things about the moschata varieties is they are easy to grow vertically, so you can grow them up a trellis, and they support the weight of their fruit so that you don't have, even though they can grow very, very large, you don't have any problem with the vines supporting them. So unlike with melons, where you have to hang a sling under the melon if you want to grow it on a trellis, these will grow and you don't really have to think about it. So so those are the reasons that I moved toward moschata and away from the Pepo varieties were because of the mildew issues that I was facing, but primarily the squash vine borer, which was just driving me absolutely nuts. What I found, though, was that there were a lot of other benefits. So I've already mentioned the climbing benefit to these squash. And so I'll tell you that the types that I grow, and they're different qualities, but they can all climb. So the butternut squash you can grow on a trellis, and I really like the butternut squash because it's a great storage squash, very sweet. Always nice to have squash in the winter time that you can just pull out of the storage and cook, and it's just like you've returned back to summertime, even though it's January or February. So I really like butternut for that reason, and a good butternut squash is a sweet squash. It's kind of a meatier texture and really terrific for holidays, and you can make a squash pie out of it. Very versatile in terms of winter squash. The other moschata variety that I grow quite a bit of is the Trombetta, also known as tromboncino squash. This is another great climber, but this is a much larger, it can be a much larger squash, but it can also be eaten as a summer squash. So much larger than the butternut squash if you want to grow it and keep it for storage. I've grown them over 6 feet long, and so large that I have to keep them in a sling in the attic where it's cool and where I am in the wintertime. it's cool up in the attic, but it doesn't quite get to freezing temperature. And I make a sling out of an old sheet, and I'll hang these giant squash up there. And then when I'm ready, I'll just take them down and cut a chunk off that perhaps is the size of a butternut squash, but I've still got another 4 or 5 foot of squash left. And I put that back, and it'll seal itself up and keep for a while longer too. So that's how you would use Trombetta in the winter time. It's not as sweet as the butternut squash, but it is a good baking squash for more savory dishes. So I would make something with it where I will slice it and I will roast it in the oven and then serve it with perhaps roasted eggplant with a Parmesan style sauce and cheese and that sort of thing. That's a really nice recipe. You can also cook it like a butternut squash, and it's just not as sweet as the butternut squash is, but it gives you another type of squash if you have both of them. So you have both the sweet in the butternut, and then you've got one that you can use for more savory dishes in the tromboncino trombetta variety. So there's a third that I have experimented with, but only as a cross with butternuts, and that is the Seminole squash. And I would like to grow this more, but in our region, the season for the Seminole squash is a little longer than we have, so I would need to start them early, and the seeds are very difficult to come by. But I have grown a cross between butternut and Seminole and had good luck with that one as well. So all three of these varieties that I'm mentioning are very tough squash when it comes to the squash vine borer. So they may become infected with the squash vine borer, but they don't seem to care, which is pretty amazing. Like I mentioned before, they're all strong climbers, and this is really good for my setup, which is a small yard. And so I will grow them on a trellis that is either on the far side of my garden so that they can get tall and get the sunshine above, and the garden in front will get the sunshine below. Sometimes I will build a trellis that goes perhaps diagonally back to just take advantage of the angle of the sun and not shade any one side of the trellis too much. But if I have more shade tolerant plants that I can plant next to the trellis that only need maybe a half a day of sunshine, I can plant those next to the trellis on either side, and then take advantage of the fact that it takes up even less space in that kind of configuration in my garden. I think for me, the most exciting thing about the squash, about winter squash in general though, is just the fact that you can store it without really thinking too much about it. Many things that I grow in my garden, I have to preserve in one way or another. And that might mean fermenting them, it might mean canning them, and that's an awful lot of work. But with squash, you can get something that will store for a long time, and all you really need to do is put it in the right environment, and it will stay perfect, and sometimes even get better throughout the course of the season, throughout the course of the winter. So like your butternut squash will get sweeter. Your trombetta or tromboncino squash will change over the course of those months from being a green squash like you might use as a summer squash to being a winter style squash, and it will form a hard shell on the outside and preserve the moisture on the inside of the squash. So just that storage function of the squash at these varieties is just extremely valuable to me as a time saver, a way to grow calories and be able to store those calories without any extra work on my part. So those are my reasons for the type of squash that I grow. I'd be interested in hearing more about the kinds of squash that you grow and why you grow them. So please drop a note for me in the comments. Please give me a thumbs up and follow this YouTube channel. And please take a look at my Instagram account, which is at Food Forest Garden Club on Instagram. And anyway, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have a wonderful day and enjoy your coffee.